Good morning. I'm Richard Wines, and I'm chair of the Riverhead Landmarks Preservation Commission. The commission is technically a committee of the town board. It was created just after the bicentennial celebration back in the 70s, and our mission is to do everything we can to preserve all of the historic resources that Riverhead is blessed to have. I've always been interested in history, even as a little boy. I did grow up here in Riverhead. I lived as a young boy just on the outskirts of downtown, and then moved up to the Northville section and grew up there. My wife and I had the good fortune to be able to retire back here about 10 years ago. In between, my interest in history took lots of different directions, including getting a PhD in Brown in the history of technology. I've taught history both at the secondary level and at the college level. One thing that's interesting about Riverhead and its historic architecture is how much variety there is. The town as a whole has buildings that date from the early 1700s, like the Jamesport Meeting House built in 1731 by the town's pioneers, right through the present day. But just looking at downtown, the oldest buildings here date from the 1840s, and we have examples of virtually every style of architecture that existed from then right through today. And that's what makes it interesting, is Greek Revival buildings like the Arts Council, the Davis Corwin House that's right behind me now, and then in the 19th century there are Italianate, there are Second Empire, there's Colonial Revival, you've got Art Deco, and right through some of the modern styles that were popular in the 1950s and 60s. There really wasn't much in this part of the town until the 1830s and 40s, when it began to develop as a commercial hub. Before that, there was only a courthouse and a bar, if you want to call it that, Griffin's Tavern, and a couple of residences. So in the 1840s, when this became important as a commercial hub, and then as an entertainment hub, and then later where people came for virtually everything, their banking needs, their medical needs. Well, to qualify as part of the Downtown Historic District, the buildings have to be at least 50 years old. So the newest examples would be like the Sears building here, built in 1949, or the building of the Riverhead project is recently renovated, which is actually dates from 1962, so it's right on the cusp of being eligible. So it's all part of a historic continuity, and every style is interesting in on its own terms. The Methodist Church in Riverhead is one of the most architecturally interesting buildings along downtown. It was built in 1869. It's not their first building. The Methodist Church started out in 1833 here, and when Methodism kind of swept over the east end of Long Island. And this is I believe, their second building. What's interesting about it is it's in the Romanesque style, which was a style that was popular, about 1000 AD. So it goes back before the medieval period even. And yet here it is in downtown Riverhead. Now, interestingly, one of Riverhead's best kept secrets is the graveyard that's here just in front of the Methodist Church. The graveyard, the oldest grave here, I believe, dates 1761, and people were buried here through the last quarter of the 19th century. But you don't see it because all of the gravestones have been turned flat on the ground, so you have to walk up into the yard of the church in order to see these stones. I believe the story is that this started out as a family graveyard, and the family donated the land to the church when the church was built, but they kept the right to continue burying family members and others here. So if you look around the graveyard, you'll see names like Yeager and Young that are really important in Riverhead history. The Star Confectionery behind me is one of Riverhead's architectural gems. It started out in 1882 as a general store belonging to a guy named Jackson. But what's interesting is the style. It's built in the Second Empire style with the mansard roof. Mansard was a French architect that helped design the Louis XIV's palace at Versailles that everyone's heard about. So we have a little bit of Second Empire right here in Riverhead. It was acquired by a Greek immigrant family around 1917, and they named it the Star Confectionery. The Star name came from, if you look up there, you'll see on the side of the building the little stars, and those are actually the ends of the retaining rods that hold the building together. So they named the building after these little devices that were put in to keep it from falling apart. And then of course a year later, the building was bought by the Maris family, who still owns it and still produce their wonderful chocolates and confections inside. Another building that people tend not to notice but is really quite interesting in Riverhead is the commercial building, which is right behind me here on 1 East Main Street, where the Dark Horse restaurant has just set up operation a couple of years ago. This building was built in 1929 and by a reasonably well-known architect locally, a guy named August Gallo, who also designed the Oddfellows Hall, the Henry Perkins Hotel, and the Suffolk County Historical Society here. He was based in Huntington, was trained in the Beaux-Arts style. But if you look at it, there's a very interesting feature up there that's kind of characteristic of all of his buildings. The style is technically colonial revival, although they didn't really build anything like that in the colonial period. That's what it was pretending to be. But if you look up there, between the floors, you'll see little blocks of brick. And inside of the big blocks of brick are little smaller blocks that are set at a diagonal like this. And if you go around Riverhead and look at all of his other buildings, you'll find that same motif. It shows up right down Roanoke Avenue here, for instance, on the Oddfellows Hall. We're standing in the alley next to the Lee Building, which brings up a bit of interesting history about partisan politics here in Riverhead and the Suffolk County. This building was originally the home of the County Review, which was the Republican Party mouthpiece for the county. The two owners of the paper originally were Henry Lee and John Hagan. One interesting bit of arcana about its history is Hagan was also the town's clerk for a while. So Hagan was working late one night and the power went off, so he lit a kerosene lantern, and much to his horror it exploded and set the building on fire. He just barely had time to stuff all of the town's records back into the safe and escape the building before it burned down, so we're lucky to still have the town's records. The back of the building is industrial from the Republican Party paper, the County Review, the ancestor of today's News Review. The front of the building is commercial from the 1930s.